This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, institutionalizing critical race theory. With us this evening and backed by popular demand, Clare Lopez, the founder and president of Lopez Liberty LLC. Clare, welcome back to the Glazov Gang.
Thank you, Jamie. Very glad to be with you again.
And thank you so much. And our show tonight is based on and credited to your powerful article at Front Page Magazine that has the same title, Institutionalizing Critical Race Theory. Fascinating stuff, very scary stuff, what the Marxists and the left overall are doing to, or is doing, what the left is doing to America and brainwashing our youth and everybody else for that matter. Clare, you're an expert on this. Why don't we just begin in general with what is critical race theory?
Yeah, that's the perfect place to start, Jamie. So critical race theory is an offshoot of the original simply critical theory. It is Marxist. It was formulated by Marxist intellectuals. And the way this came about, following, of course, the 1917 Russian Revolution, Lenin, the Bolsheviks won and took over the country. The first thought, of course, with communism is to export it. And because the revolution in Russia depended on a clash, contrived clash between classes, the proletariat, that would be the worker class, and the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the wealthy. That was the first thought for the export of communism by the Soviet Comintern, Communist International. But when they looked at America as a target, as they very quickly did, certainly by the 20s, no later than the early 1930s, they realized that in America, with our free market capitalist system, that equation of proletariat versus the bourgeoisie was not going to take. It wasn't going to work because our free market capitalist system offers real, genuine opportunity to anyone who's willing to apply talent and hard work to advance in life. And so many people, including many immigrants to America, found that to be true. And in their own lives, it was true. It was happening for them and their families. This wasn't going to work, bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And so these Marxist intellectuals thought about, well, how can we instigate revolution in America without a class struggle? And what they did is they hit upon race. Race in America is an absurdly sensitive topic, and they realized that if they could instigate, if they could, rub raw, as Saul Alinsky might say, the antagonisms, the resentments, the anger surrounding race in America, they could have their revolution. And that was the foundation of critical race theory, where the original critical theory was simply criticize anything capitalist, bourgeoisie, free market. But now critical race theory is a refinement of that by the Marxist intellectuals who came here to America in the early 1900s, and they hit upon race.
Right. And so, Clare, overall, Marxists, leftists, one and the same thing, they don't want people to be happy. And even if there is a successful social experiment, the most successful social experiment, economic experiment in world history, like in America, which has just given so much equality and prosperity and wealth to people, in comparison to everywhere else on earth, they still want there to be anger, rage. So in general, Marxism it wants people angry. It wants people to be unhappy. Just as Lenin was saying, we know that Lenin didn't, hated music. We know Khomeini hated music. Lenin was saying if you like music too much, you might get into the disposition of wanting to pat a dog on its head. And Lenin was saying that's a bad thing. There needs to be rage and anger all the time. So this is very interesting stuff and very frightening stuff to know what's at the heart of leftists. And so for critical race theory in America, everything is about race. So there's somebody is definitely oppressed racially. Now they couldn't do this economically because life is just too good in America. And so racism is involved in every single personal interaction. That's according to critical race theory, right?
That's absolutely right. Yes. And, we have examples. For example, a gentleman, an African-American man by the name of Manning Johnson, who wrote a slim paperback monograph published in 1958, I believe it was, talked about how in the United States, the Marxists very deliberately targeted African-American populations. And we can hardly remember, or, even our grandparents perhaps remember, but in the earlier part of the 1900s, and up until I would say the 1960s even, African Americans in the United States, despite discrimination, segregation, certainly in the South, but they were a thriving community in many places. They were intact families. They were families that were full of faith and worshiped in churches. And it wasn't until the 1960s that all of that fell apart. But Manning Johnson wrote about color communism and the revolution, wrote about how communists targeted African Americans viciously, venomously, maliciously to pull them into communism, which would tear apart these foundational values of their strong family and faith traditions. And they succeeded. Now, Manning Johnson himself, being a well-educated man and a courageous one too, broke away from communism after being drawn into it for around 10 years or so. But his monograph is a good example of how they were targeted to be pulled into communism, to do just as what you just said, Jamie, to rub raw anger and resentment in society. You cannot have a revolution if people are content and happy, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about how the Chinese communists targeted American African Americans too.
And we'll get to that. And so, Claire, just when you sit back and think about this, my family's from the Soviet Union, and so we love America. I love America. I don't love the America that the left is trying to create on the ashes of the America that it's trying to destroy. I love the America that the left wants to destroy, that precious experiment of freedom. And when I think about America and everything that I love about it, the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, that right to be happy, which of course leftists hate, and those principles of equality, that everybody's equal. And we know that on that foundation, that the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, that was the foundation for later for America to break free of its racist past, that America was able to make so much progress, and why slavery was abolished and why the civil rights movement was able to to occur. All of it was based in the American Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution. So when we look at the critical race theory, it's a very un-American idea. It's a counter-American revolution in a lot of respects. It rejects America, and it rejects everything that America stands for.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think I've spoken on this program before, and your viewers, your listeners will recall we talked about the aspirational aspect of the Declaration of Independence, of course, written at a time when there was indeed slavery in the United States. But the founders and the authors, especially Thomas Jefferson, but the others too, when the Declaration was written, they understood that the society they lived in at the time was not perfect. They were not, they may have owned slaves by inheritance or whatever, but they did not support slavery. They supported the equality of all people before the rule of law. And so the Declaration has to be understood in its aspirational, its inspirational aspect, which only came to fruition, unfortunately, after a horrific civil war. But then later on, as you said, Jamie, exactly, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs and so forth. And we're still not perfect, but we have lived up as best we can to those inspirational words of the Declaration. And that's what sets us apart. It's not that we're perfect or we're then, but that we're constantly striving to reach the full fulfillment of that message in the Declaration.
Thank you, Claire. Claire, critical race theory is a repudiation of Martin Luther King's world outlook and philosophy, right?
Yes, because what did Martin Luther King say, among, well, many things, but that people should be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And critical race theory turns that completely upside down on its head. What is going on, running rampant through American institutions right now, academia, business, industry, government, is precisely the opposite of what Martin Luther King said. It is specifically judging people by the color of their skin and demeaning those who are not African American, Black, those who are white specifically, an innate characteristic that none of us could have anything to do with. We're born that way, but being discriminated against because of race and innate characteristics, like skin color.
Right. And so, look, critical race theory wants to destroy Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, and it wants to tell Americans, you're this color, and you're this color, and you're an oppressor, and you're oppressed, and you're a victim, and you're an oppressor, and you have privilege, and you don't, and just... And you need to understand that this country is based on hatred and racism, and this country is hateful and racism, and everything needs to be overturned. There needs to be a revolution. We need to set up a Marxist paradise, etc., etc. So we know where all of that leads. We know that that leads to the killing fields in Cambodia under Pol Pot. We know that it leads to the Maoist Cultural Revolution. We know that it leads to the Stalinist killing fields. 100 million people were murdered at the least because of this idea in the 20th century. So President Biden, the leader of America, is taking a very interesting stand in terms of what he wants the education departments to do in America. You've written about this, and it's quite horrifying.
Yeah, I think it is. So to take us back to the Trump administration just briefly, it was under that presidency that Trump established the 1776 Commission, which we've talked about on your program here before, Jamie. And that was in response to the 1619 Project. And the 1776 Commission was established to promote and to champion the principles of our founding fathers, the Judeo-Christian principles that undergird our system of constitutional democracy, or really the constitutional republic. And so what this administration has done now, it was like on the first or second day, I think, was first of all to dismantle President Trump's 1776 Commission, to erase the final report of the 1776 Commission from the White House website. It can still be found online if you want to look for it. A search of 1776 Commission final report will bring it up, but erased from the White House website. And instead, just this past week, in fact, we're in April of 2021 here, the Biden Education Department has indicated that it wants to push critical race theory into all of America's public schools. Well, it's not just in the public schools, it's in the private and the charter too. So they released.
So we got to teach our kids to hate America. Yeah. And also to teach white children that they should be ashamed and engage in Maoist self-recrimination sessions, right?
Yeah, struggle sessions, as they might have called them back in the 60s in China. The text of a new proposed rule has come from the Education Department that would establish priorities for the awarding of grants, government federal grants in American history and civics education programs, this being for US public schools. And we know where this is going. If this becomes indeed, you know, the rule, the priority of the Education Department of the Biden administration, this is going to be shoved into K through 12 classes. And it's not just in, you know, history or civics. This stuff is permeating everything: reading, writing, even math. We're hearing in various places now is teaching that to demand students reach the right answer and show their work for how they got there, that's racist.
So just a sec, if you're a student that thinks 3 + 2 is 8 and a teacher says you're wrong and you might be a certain color, the teacher might be racist for telling you you're wrong, right?
This is what's going on. Yeah, already, even before the Education Department really gets wound up here. Now think about what's going on in China. Our near peer, if not peer, competitor, adversary, enemy in the world today. The kids in China are going to school from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. Then they go more back to school on the weekends for test prep. They're studying STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math from the earliest grades. They're not studying gender studies or whatever. They don't have any of this stuff going on in their schools. How's this going to work out?
Yeah, this is pretty dark stuff, haunting stuff. Claire, what could possibly be the motives of people like Biden, Kamala Harris, the people around them? What could possibly be the motives of pushing this thing? Because we know what its origins are and we know where it leads. And these are not stupid people. And you know, I've always had a problem with people that think that there's naivete among leftists. And yeah, you got an idiot here or two here, but there's a lot of malice here, isn't there?
There is. It is methodical. And I'll refer back, and this is in my article up at Front Page Magazine. I refer in the article to Antonio Gramsci's, at least it's attributed to him, long march through the institutions. This is methodical, this is planned, this is a stepped process. And I also talk about former FBI agent W. Cleon Skouson's book, The Naked Communist, and particularly chapter 13 of that book, which lists the 45 goals of communism. It's called 45 Goals of Communism today, but it was written in 1958. And if you look at those 45 goals now, I challenge anyone to find more than a handful that don't have a check mark next to them. But one of the most important of them, I think, was number 17, goal number 17. Get control of the schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda, soften the curriculum, get control of the teachers' associations. This indeed, as you say, Jamie, they know what they're doing. Maybe not the president, but those around whom are actually running the US government right now, they are Marxist. And all anyone has to do to confirm that is go back to 2020 and the list of recommendations, the task force, it was called the Unity Task Force recommendations, published in 2020 for the Democrat Party. And in that summary, it had categories like healthcare, justice reform, education system, all of that. And in each category, take a look at this, were listed either 3, 4 or so Democrat Party leadership figures who were in charge of drafting that section. There you will find the Marxist leadership of the Democrat Party. And from that Unity Task Force list was distilled the shorter Democrat Party platform of last year, 2020. And I dare anyone to lay both of those, either of those, side by side with the Marx Engels 1848 Communist Manifesto, and you tell me if you can find a hair's breadth of difference between them.
In your article, Claire, you make a reference to rules for radicals, Alinsky, and to tell us a little bit about that, because what the left is doing today, what the Black Lives Matter, what these critical race theory pushers are doing, it's very much part of Rules for Radicals, isn't it?
It absolutely is. So Rules for Radicals, of course, is the famous handbook, if you will, written by Saul Alinsky, a Marxist of the mid last century or so, was his heyday. He is now no longer with us, happily. But the textbook, Rules for Radicals, is methodical blueprint, handbook, playbook for how to tear apart American society. It was vicious and venomous, but it talked about how to take Americans who typically, we grew up in a tolerant, a multicultural, multiracial society, maybe living in different neighborhoods, but we were tolerant people. And somehow insert divisive wedges into that society to deliberately tear apart our society. That's what Rules for Radicals is about. And that is what's going on in American society right now, with the race, the wedge issue of race being manipulated, being used exactly as laid out in Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals.
Yeah. Claire, you take this question into the direction you would like to in your answer. I just want to say something here, because we see very much a spiritual war right in front of us. There's something obviously very evil here, and those of us that believe in God and know that evil forces exist, and I'm a Christian, I believe in the devil, and of course in Jesus Christ. So as a Christian, when I look at this here, I see something very evil here, because when you have, for instance, Black Lives Matter emphasizing very much certain lives that matter and certain lives that don't matter, because that's where it's actually going. I often think about, but Jesus died for everybody. There's nobody that Jesus did not die for. And when we think about critical race theory and this emphasis on race, and that the human being ultimately is all about just the color of skin, there's something very anti-Christian in that. There's something that erases the soul. There's something that it's an attempt to erase what Jesus did for us on the cross. It's a very, very evil thing to just stress that the human being is only about the color of their skin. Could you touch on that in your own way? But there's definitely something very evil here, and the erasing of a human being's soul, and also the redemption that Christ offers with his sacrifice.
This absolutely is pure evil, and a couple of things come to mind. I am just now beginning to read, I haven't even gotten into it yet, but Paul Kingor's relatively recent book, The Devil and Karl Marx. So I can't tell you yet, how what's in it. I haven't gotten far along yet, but I've just begun it. But that, as I understand, lays this out, the absolute evil of Karl Marx. And we can go back, to look at his life and what he stood for. And, our good friend, brilliant scholar, Stephen Coughlin, talks about the basis of Marxism is nihilism. It is, in his phrase, Aufheben der Kultur. Aufheben der Kultur means in German, in English, that's German. In English, it means destroy the culture. What would the modern day narrative of that be? It would be cancel culture, right? And so from Marx, from the very beginning, the intent was to tear apart, to destroy, nihilism, without necessarily even any idea of something better that would take its place. Now, many of those, uneducated college campus kids, for example, who think that socialism and Marxism and communism are the best things since sliced bread, they don't know this. They don't know that there is nothing that comes after nihilism. They think that they're striving for some kind of utopia on earth, which doesn't exist, never has, never will. But in fact, what it is with Marx, pure evil, it is nihilism. It is utter destruction. It is tear it apart. You can hear it even in the slogans being chanted on the streets sometimes in America now. What is it? Burn it all down. They're not saying we're going to rebuild it in an equitable and kumbaya way. No, that's not what they're saying. They're saying burn it all down, destroy it. It is pure evil. It is pure nihilism. Yes.
Yeah. And there's no surprise that at these Antifa BLM rallies and riots that they have a fire and they burn Bibles. Claire, so, it never ceases to amaze us or surprise us how much, well, maybe we're not surprised anymore. I guess that's an expression, but we know that these Marxists hate the people that they're pretending that they want to liberate and help. We know that workers that Marxists spoke on behalf of suffered the most and suffer the most under Marxism in practice. And so when we see the BLM and these critical race theory people and all that, and when they speak for black people, we know that they are the most racist of all. And we know that the end result of their policies is always the suffering and impoverishment and victimization of black people. Can you speak on that a bit? Because when we really look at the Democratic Party and at these leftists, they pay lip service to abolishing racism, but they're the most racist of all, and they hurt the very people they pretend they want to protect, right?
Absolutely. And again, the purpose of that is to instigate anger, resentment, and ultimately revolution, in which the chaos of which they hope to seize power, to complete the destruction of the United States of America, our constitutional republic, and really Western civilization. I'll go back to my mention of Manning Johnson, the African American who got lured into communism, but then, smart enough, educated enough, and from a Christian family broke free. But what he said in that pamphlet that I mentioned before is that he realized that the communists that he was serving here in America, the Marxists, were horrifically racist themselves. That's part of what made him feel so repulsed by this, but many other things too. Let me mention as well the connection with China, because back in the 1960s, in the upheaval of that time, of course, we'll recall the Black Panthers came to prominence, and they were deeply involved in the rioting and the burning and the looting and all of the rest of it. Well, at that time, the leadership of the Black Panther Party including Huey P. Newton and Stokely Carmichael and et cetera. Robert Williams was affiliated, Elaine Brown. These leadership figures, Marxists of the Black Panther Party, developed a relationship with the Chinese communist leadership. And this is the time of Mao Zedong, of course, Zhou Enlai, his deputy. And these Black Panther figures traveled multiple times to Beijing to meet with Mao and Zhou Enlai. And we know this because they were photo ops and they took pictures with them. You can find the pictures. And the most racist people on the face of the earth, or well, close to anyway, are the Chinese. But yet they were using these people, manipulating these people, as they do to this day, their descendants, each ideological descendants anyway, of the Chinese Communist Party. And today's Black Lives Matter movement, not quite so many delegations going over to Beijing, but the connections are there anyway, maintained through China's diplomatic missions, the consulates across the United States. The same kind of relationship, using the African-American population to drive the revolution, to drive animosity and hatred and racial hatred, when they themselves are among the most racial people on the face of the earth.
Thank you so much, Claire. And let's just expand on that for 1 second, because what you're saying is very important. And in critical race theory, among leftists, for instance, there's always this assumption that when it comes to racism and slavery, it's just white people that did it. It's just white people that are engaged in these things. At the same time, we know that it was America that abolished slavery. We know that America, in many respects, is one of the least racist societies in the world when compared to other societies. And so when you mention the Chinese here, and so it's very obvious, we're not saying that every single Chinese person is a racist, of course not. But you are emphasizing that if you want to find racism, it's not just in the white world, among white people, and that there's actually quite a bit of vicious racism in the Chinese culture as well. Do you want to just expand on that and put it into context?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. So human beings are tribal by nature. Human beings tend to group by themselves, by their own, by tribes, in an ancient way. And racism has, bedeviled every single society, civilization that's ever been on the face of the earth. And by singling out China, what I really mean to do is to single out the Chinese Communist Party. Because from the time of Mao and Zhou Enlai to today with Xi Jinping, it is the Chinese Communist Party that is trying to use race in America to divide American society, to bring on what they hope, the Chinese Communist Party hopes to be revolution.
Yeah. Well,
and that's what's going on.
And thank you, Claire. And I think I would also just throw in there on this as well, when the left is always going on about, racism in America, and yet at the same time, of course, we don't want to minimize when awful things happen and when racism on many levels does exist and pops up its ugly head. But we know that within the American framework, it is repudiated and dealt with. And we think about the abolition of slavery, for instance, which we talked about. We talk about the civil rights movement, of all the progress that has been made because of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then we think about Islamic Sharia. And we know that slavery is still practiced to this day. We know that black people are enslaved in African countries such as Mauritania and Sudan. And the left doesn't do a thing about that and won't say a word about that when asked to help those suffering black people in Africa that are enslaved by Arab masters. And Charles Jacobs has done great work on this. And so that's just to show the double standards of leftists on these issues. Claire, our time is up, but before we go, thank you so much for exposing this evil of critical race theory, give our audience some hope and perhaps some suggestions of what can also be done. There's great organizations like Moms for Liberty right now that are standing up to take, you know, the control back from the unions, from these educators, and to play a role in what their children are being taught. And we should just stand up and not be bullied by these Marxists. Let's end on that in terms of what people can be doing to counteract this indoctrination.
Well, I am going to write 2 or 3 more pieces in this series for the Front Page magazine. And within those forthcoming articles, I'm going to talk about how parents all over this country are becoming aware of what's going on. You know, little bit of a silver lining to the lockdowns of the past year. The parents were stuck at home, couldn't go to work. The kids were stuck at home, couldn't go to school. And parents, many times for the first time, were looking over the kids' shoulders at their lessons on the computers, and they're horrified, they're appalled, and then they're angry. And what they've begun to do is to band together. This is exactly what parents need to do, or grandparents, relatives, you know, through the family. And that is to take note of what is being taught, and they're doing this. And then they are grouping together all over the country to go to school boards. And by the way, a lot of the school board meetings are now online webinars also. And so many more can participate than maybe could have, you know, before they weren't so stuck at home, and they had work and jobs to go to, commuting every day. Well, they're going to the school boards. And when they group together to go to the school boards with specific statements to make, specific observations, for example, about what's in the textbooks, or specific examples about what they do not want to see, they're seeing in some of the PowerPoint presentations, for example, or some of what's going on in the classrooms. You alluded to it a bit, Jamie, the dividing of kids into racial groupings, one the oppressed, one the oppressors, and forcing the kids at the lowest level of grade level, you know, to admit to racial divisions. And so the parents are seeing this, but get together, pay attention to what's going on in your kids' classrooms, their programs, their textbooks, and then get with other parents. You may be surprised, maybe you won't be surprised, but how many parents think just like you do. You're not alone. I am telling you, across this entire country, there are a whole lot more of us than there are of them. But when parents get together in a very respectful and polite way with specific messages to take to the school board, they can get results. And that's what I would say. Speak up, and then go and attend whatever you can be part of in terms of school board meetings, or even at your local school, the PTA, PTO, if you're able to do that. That is how you're going to get results. It's happening.
Fantastic, Claire. Thank you so much. Very quickly, where can people find you to support your work and to follow you?
Well, I am still amazingly on social media at Clare M. Lopez, on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm at Telegram, Parlay as well. You can find my writing, of course, at Front Page Magazine, but also at Citizens Commission on National Security, at the United West, and the Sharia Crime Stoppers, which is going to begin again in May, programs every Monday night. I'll be part of that. And of course, at American Truth Project with Barry Nussbaum, and finally at Brannon House's website, World View Weekend. So those are the places where my videos and my writing can be found.
Fantastic. Claire, thank you for all that you do for America and for freedom, and telling the truth about these vicious Marxist ideologies and the leftist agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you so much. We don't, before I go, I'd also like to say, ladies and gentlemen, support the group Moms for Liberty that's doing a very noble thing in terms of fighting this pernicious leftist agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, also keep in mind, due to the censorship and persecution we're facing on YouTube, we've moved over to Rumble. So go to our Rumble channel, go to Rumble, look up the Glazov Gang, subscribe to us there, and make sure you have instant notifications for our show. And we'll see you soon on the Glazov Gang. Good night.